Most organizations come to Fabric with the same comforting assumption. If we get the permissions right, the numbers will be right. They are wrong. Your real problem is not who can open a report. It's what that report thinks revenue means this week. Fabric feels dangerous because it industrializes meaning. Once a metric definition leaks into the platform, it doesn't stay local. It propagates, mutates, and quietly competes with every other definition you never retired. So the useful question is not how do I lock Fabric down? The useful question is, how do I keep my data model from drifting faster than my governance can follow? If you're responsible for enterprise data trust, this is for you. Because Fabric is secure by design, your data model will still drift. The only real choice you have is whether that drift is observed and governed, or silent and catastrophic at AI speed. Why Fabric feels like too much power? Most people meet Fabric through the marketing diagram. One lake, many workloads, everything unified. They translate that as a tool story. Architecturally, it is something else. You've collapsed engineering, warehousing, BI, and AI into a single plane, all wired into Entra as the decision engine. One tenant, one identity fabric, one logical lake. Every role assignment, every workspace, every shortcut participates in a shared authorization graph. That is a lot of power in one place. So the first questions you hear internally are completely predictable. Who can see what? Who owns this model? Why do we already have two answers for the same KPI? Those questions aren't new. What's new is the speed at which Fabric lets you get to them. Historically, your architecture protected you from yourself through friction. ERP lived over here, the data warehouse team lived over there, Power BI sat on top, usually a release cycle behind. To change a core metric, someone had to fight their way through ETL, schema changes, cube processing, and a deployment window. That slowness was annoying, but it also throttled semantic drift. Every change hurt just enough that people argued before they shipped a new definition. Fabric removes most of that friction. Direct Lake lets a Power BI semantic model sit almost directly on top of delta tables in one lake. No scheduled imports, no fragile refresh window. Self-service workspaces let domain teams spin up their own lakehouses, warehouses, and models without ever filing a central ticket. Cloning a workspace or semantic model is a couple of clicks, not a quarter's work. You didn't just modernize performance, you modernized the propagation of meaning. Here's the pattern that shows up in tenant after tenant. Adoption starts small and controlled. One or two central workspaces, a lakehouse or warehouse, a curated semantic model, a handful of official reports. Everything feels orderly. Then acceleration kicks in. More teams want access. They ask for just a copy of the semantic model to tweak a filter, or just our own workspace to move faster. Direct Lake makes that copy basically free. So does OneLake's shared storage. Semantic drift follows. Those copied models diverge. One region excludes certain customers. One business unit adds a manual adjustment. Another team redefines active customer to meet their local target. The names on the measures don't change, the DAX does. Finally, trust collapses. Executives walk into a steering committee and discover three different truths about revenue, churn, risk, all sourced from the same ERP, all flowing through the same Fabric tenant, all protected by the same RBAC model. Security worked. Nobody broke in. The platform behaved exactly as designed, but the meaning moved. This is why Fabric feels like too much power. It isn't that the platform is out of control. It's that your previous architecture hid the fact that you never had a robust way to govern semantics in the first place. The friction made the gaps survivable. Now that friction is gone. The gaps are visible. Direct Lake is a good example of this acceleration. In a traditional import model, changing a schema or measure definition had a natural governor, the refresh process. Break the model and the refresh fails. Someone notices there's a clear failure point. Direct Lake connects the semantic model almost directly to the storage engine. Change the delta table, and the semantic model might keep working just enough to be dangerous. Columns still exist, relationships still resolve. Only a handful of reports show subtle shifts in filters and totals. You remove the mechanical canary. Self-service workspaces compound this. When every domain can spin up its own engineering, modeling, and reporting stack, you've effectively created dozens of parallel semantic layers over the same physical data. Some are carefully modeled, some are copied from wherever someone had access. Some are experiments that accidentally become production because an executive bookmarked the report. Easy cloning is the final accelerant. Every time someone says, we'll just clone it and tweak a bit for our needs, you've created another fork of meaning with no lifecycle plan. There's no compilation step where a central architect has to approve the new definition. Most organizations respond to this unease by reaching for the wrong lever. They double down on access control. More groups, more conditional access, more workspace restrictions, more reviews of who can see which report. All of that is fine. Necessary even. But here's the uncomfortable truth. You can have perfect RBAC and completely untrustworthy numbers. You can pass every security audit and still have no idea which revenue metric your CEO should quote to the market. The perceived risk is external: hackers, leaks, regulatory fines. The lived daily risk is internal. Nobody believes the dashboards. Fabric didn't invent that risk. It just stopped hiding it behind batch windows and siloed tools. So before we go any further, hold on to this distinction. Platform security answers, who is allowed to touch this object? Governance of meaning answers, what does this object actually say? Fabric gives you an excellent answer to the first question. It gives you almost no answer to the second. That's why it feels like too much power. Once you see that clearly, the next move is obvious. You have to separate the layers you've been blurring together: security, data governance, and semantic governance. Only then can you decide what Fabric actually secures for you and where your data model is guaranteed to drift. Security versus data governance versus semantic governance. Once you stop blaming Fabric for being too open, you can ask the only question that matters. What exactly is Microsoft securing for you, and what isn't even in scope? Most organizations blur three completely different layers into one vague word: governance. Architecturally, those layers are separate systems with separate responsibilities. The first layer is platform security. This is Microsoft's job. Entra handles authentication. Conditional access decides under which device, network, and risk conditions a token is issued. Fabric workspaces and item permissions express who can administer, contribute, or view. OneLake security and role-based access decide which tables, folders, or rows a given identity can touch. Underneath that, you get encryption at rest, TLS in transit, multi-geo boundaries, audit logs, DLP, and sensitivity labels through Purview, and a compliance envelope that already satisfies regulators who are far more aggressive than your internal audit team. In other words, the control plane and data plane are well defended. If Fabric were fundamentally insecure, Microsoft wouldn't be running its own financials on the same architecture. That distinction matters because it means your core risk is almost never, is the platform safe? The platform is as safe as it is going to get. Your real problem is the second layer, data governance. Data governance is your job. This is where you decide who owns which data sets, which domains exist, which workspaces are allowed to touch regulated data, how long data is retained, and how classification flows. You define read and write boundaries, onboarding and offboarding, lifecycle for lakehouses and warehouses, and what happens when a project ends but its data assets live on. You decide whether PHI sits only in a healthcare domain. You decide whether payroll data can ever be shortcut into a general analytics lakehouse. You decide whether every production dataset has a named owner or just belongs to BI. When people say, we need better governance, this is usually the layer they think they're talking about, even if they only ever touch it via tickets to the central team. But there is a third layer, and this is where Fabric quietly hurts you: semantic governance. Semantic governance answers questions that platform security and data governance don't even try to address. What does customer mean in this model? At what grain is revenue defined? Which filters are always applied when we report active anything? Which team is allowed to redefine that logic? This is the ignored layer, the layer of metrics, business logic, naming, and grain. The layer where DAX lives, where SQL views define golden tables, where notebooks materialize KPI logic in code because there was no certified model available. Most catastrophic Fabric failures happen here, not in the platform security layer. Nothing in Entra stops you from having 5 different total revenue measures, all with the same display name, each applying slightly different filters. Nothing in OneLake security complains when 3 domains create their own customer dimension with conflicting surrogate keys. Nothing in Purview lights up when someone silently changes the definition of churned customer from 90 days of inactivity to 30. Fabric doesn't just host semantics. Fabric industrializes meaning. Once a DAX measure, a SQL view, or a curated table is shared and referenced, its definition stops being local. It becomes a dependency. Every downstream report, Excel workbook, data flow, and Copilot answer inherits that meaning, until someone forks it, renames nothing, and quietly diverges. This is where semantic drift becomes dangerous. Schema drift, columns added, types changed, is noisy. Queries break, refreshes fail, engineers get paged, someone notices, semantic drift is silent, the columns are still there, the data types still match, security is still enforced. But the calculation behind net sales has gained an exclusion or lost an adjustment or change time windows. Only the people who lived through the change even remember it happened. Security tooling is blind to this. Data governance catalogs it at best as another data set. Semantic governance asks a different set of questions. Which semantic models are authoritative for core entities like customer, product, revenue? Who is allowed to publish or change those definitions? How do we signal to the rest of the organization which meanings are reusable at scale? How do we detect when those meanings drift? Without explicit answers, Fabric will happily let every domain define its own truth, secure it perfectly, classify it correctly, and serve it at speed. So when you look at your Fabric tenant and feel that mix of power and unease, remember the layering. Platform security is Microsoft's problem, and they've largely solved it. Data governance is your problem, and most of you have at least a partial handle on it. Semantic governance is nobody's problem by default, which means it's where reality quietly diverges from intent. Once you accept that, the next step is to be precise about what Fabric actually secures for you, and then catalog the forms of drift that walk straight past that perfectly functional security model every single day. What Microsoft Fabric actually secures. Now that the layers are separated, we can finally answer the boring but essential question: what does Fabric actually secure for you in deterministic terms? Start with identity and access. Every interaction with Fabric flows through Entra. A user, a service principal, a managed identity, they all authenticate there. Conditional access decides whether that token is allowed under your rules. Compliant device, trusted network, MFA, risk level acceptable. Only once that token exists does Fabric even enter the picture. Inside Fabric, that identity hits workspace roles and item level permissions. Workspaces define who administers, who can edit, who can contribute data, who only views. Items, lakehouses, warehouses, semantic models, notebooks add their own ACLs on top. OneLake Security sits underneath as the data plane gatekeeper. At that layer, you can decide that a particular table is visible to one group and invisible to another. You can constrain access to specific folders in files or enforce row and column level rules at the storage engine, not just in a report. So if someone asks, can user X query table Y through Spark, SQL, or Direct Lake? The system can give you a clear, rule-driven answer. That part is solid. Move up a level and you have the data plane itself. OneLake is the logical lake, shortcuts, mirrored sources, native Delta and Parquet files, but from a security perspective, it's still just objects and ACLs. A warehouse table, a lakehouse table, a KQL database, they're all governed by roles and permissions that Fabric and Entra evaluate on every request. Workspaces provide a kind of blast radius boundary here. A badly written notebook can still be dangerous, but only inside the capacity and the access scope you've given that workspace. Domains add a logical overlay. They don't enforce security by themselves, but they group workspaces so you can reason about where regulated data should and shouldn't live. On the consumption side, the same model repeats. A Power BI semantic model, whether it's import, direct query, or direct lake, still respects the underlying identity, workspace role, and any row or object level security you've defined. If a user isn't allowed to see a customer segment at the table, they won't see it in the visual. If a column is masked or hidden at the OneLake layer, Copilot doesn't magically resurrect it in a chat. From Fabric's point of view, every engine, Spark, SQL, DAX, Copilot, is just another client of the same authorization fabric. Compliance instrumentation wraps around all of this. Purview can scan Fabric, register it as a data source, classify assets, and apply sensitivity labels that then flow downstream. Activity logs tell you who touched which artifact, when, and from where. DLP policies can flag or block data moving out of safe zones, exports to Excel, downloads of PBX, sharing outside the tenant. If you want to answer who has accessed this PHI table in the last 30 days, or where does this highly confidential dataset flow? The combination of Fabric logs and Purview lineage can give you a satisfactory audit trail. So, viewed purely as a platform, the picture is reassuring. Authentication is centralized. Authorization is consistent. Data access is controllable down to rows and columns. Activity is observable. Compliance envelopes are present. If you stay inside that frame, the natural instinct is to keep tightening it. More labels, more policies, more reviews, more conditions. But this is where the earlier distinction becomes lethal if you ignore it. Fabric is very good at securing objects. It is completely agnostic about what those objects mean. You can have two semantic models, both carefully labeled, both living in the right domain, both with restricted access, both with full audit trails, and still have them implement revenue in mutually exclusive ways. From a security standpoint, nothing is wrong. From a decision standpoint, everything is broken. This is why the right question is not, is Fabric safe? But what exactly are we securing? The platform can guarantee only the right identities connect. Only allowed tables, folders, and rows are returned. Only approved paths are used to move data. Only labeled exports leave the boundary. It cannot guarantee that the metric you're staring at means what you think it means, that it meant the same thing last quarter, that the AI agent you just enabled is grounded on the correct version of that meaning. So when you hear, we need better Fabric governance, translate it. You almost never mean we don't trust Entra. You mean we don't know which definitions we've actually put into production. The security model is done. You inherit it. The governance of meaning is not. You design it, or you operate a perfectly secure platform for uncontrolled semantic drift. Where governance breaks, the four drift patterns. Once you accept that Fabric secures objects, not meaning, you can start naming the ways that meaning quietly walks away from intent. There are four drift patterns that show up in almost every serious tenant: access drift, model drift, metric drift, ownership drift. Each one is predictable, each one is cumulative, and each one walks straight past your perfectly functioning security model. Start with access drift. On day one, access is simple. A few core groups, a couple of workspaces, clear roles. Over time, reality intervenes. Someone important needs temporary access to a workspace just for this quarter. A project team needs broader read-writes until we stabilize. Contractors arrive, external partners get guest accounts. Nested groups come in from Entra that nobody fully understands. Because Fabric is a collaboration platform, the path of least resistance is always the same. Just add them as a viewer. We'll clean it up later. Later never comes. Those exceptions accumulate. Groups contain other groups, people change roles but keep access in case they need to help with something. Service principals get granted broader rights because nobody wants to debug a failing pipeline in the middle of the night. Your security posture on paper is least privilege. Your effective access graph in Entra is anything but. The drift here isn't just that more people can see more things, it's that your mental model of who can touch which semantic layer stops matching the actual configuration. You're no longer governing, you're guessing. Now, model drift. This is the physical shape of the data, schemas, tables, relationships, and views. A new source system is onboarded. A team adds a temporary staging table that turns into a de facto goal table because somebody built a report on it. A column's meaning changes, but the name doesn't. Someone optimizes a table for performance and silently drops attributes that downstream models depended on. None of this is malicious. It's normal engineering churn. In a traditional warehouse, that churn was gated by ETL processes, integration tests, release cycles. In Fabric, engineers, analysts, and even power users can all participate in changing the shape of the data with fewer barriers. So the tables your semantic models point at are not static objects. They are moving targets. Without explicit model contracts and impact analysis, every schema tweak risks creating a forked reality, one part of the organization referencing the new shape, another still living in the old. Then there is metric drift. This is the semantic layer itself. DAX measures, SQL-defined KPIs, calculated columns, business rules embedded in notebooks. Metric drift is what happens when multiple teams use the same words: revenue, customer, churn, risk, but implement them with different filters, grains, or business assumptions. One team excludes internal transfers from revenue, another doesn't. One region reports churn on a 30-day inactivity window, another uses 90 days. Finance defines active customer as billable in the last period. Sales defines it as any customer with an open opportunity. In isolation, each definition is locally rational. At enterprise scale, they are mutually incompatible. Fabric accelerates this drift because it makes it trivial to clone semantic models, tweak a measure, and publish a new version without any central arbitration. Every fork looks trustworthy. Every fork can be certified inside its own workspace. Every fork shows up in Copilot as a viable source of truth. Finally, ownership drift. This one is less visible but architecturally fatal. On the day a dataset or semantic model is created, somebody owns it. There's an engineer, an analyst, a product owner. Over time, people change roles. Teams reorg, projects end, contractors leave, the Fabric item remains. Workspaces accumulate orphaned lakehouses, abandoned semantic models, half-maintained pipelines. Reports nobody admits to owning continue to refresh because they might be used by someone important. When something breaks, nobody is accountable. When a definition needs to change, nobody has the authority. When AI starts consuming those models, nobody feels responsible for what the agent is saying. Ownership drift turns every other form of drift into unpayable security debt. Because here is the uncomfortable law of large Fabric environments. Drift is not a failure. Unobserved drift is. Access will widen, models will evolve, metrics will fork, people will move on. Self-service, domain teams, and agile delivery guarantee it. If you design as though drift is avoidable, you will always be surprised, always be reactive, and always be tempted to blame the platform. If you design on the assumption that drift is constant, then the question changes. Not how do we stop this, but how do we see it, measure it, and decide which meanings we are willing to let scale. These 4 drift patterns are not theoretical, they show up in recognizable, painful ways. So to make this real, we're going to walk through 5 enterprise scenarios where everything we've just described plays out in public. Finance arguing over revenue, healthcare exposing PHI in the wrong lakehouse, retail turning self-service into shadow analytics, manufacturing turning one lake into a junk drawer, and AI confidently weaponizing every ungoverned definition you ever shipped. Concrete, anonymized, but architecturally identical to what's already brewing inside your tenant. Scenario 1. Finance. Same revenue, 3 answers. Let's start where drift hurts fastest. Finance. Assume for a moment that the plumbing is perfect. You have one ERP, the chart of accounts is clean enough to survive audit, there's a well-understood data export or integration pattern. Fabric is ingesting that data into one lake through a controlled pipeline, a warehouse, a lakehouse, or both. The numbers landing in storage match the source system. No data quality story to hide behind. No exotic multi-ERP nightmare. On top of that shared foundation, 3 teams go to work: finance, sales, and operations. Each of them gets their own Fabric workspace. That sounds healthy. It lines up with org structure. They all connect to the same curated tables in one lake. Maybe they even start from a shared base semantic model the central team provided, and then the entropy generators switch on. Finance takes the base model and adds the adjustments they care about. They exclude certain internal orders. They apply their standard FX logic, and they define recognized revenue with the cutoff rules the auditors expect. They create a revenue measure that reflects that view of the world. Sales clones the same model because someone told them correctly that we should all be using the same data. But their reality is pipeline and performance. They tweak the date logic to align with their commission periods. They exclude a small set of accounts that are house customers nobody carries a quota on. They build revenue in a way that matches how they manage the field. Operations does the same for fulfillment and capacity. They care about shipped units, backlog, and throughput. They tweak the filters again. They might even introduce a simple lag so that revenue better reflects operational load instead of pure booking. None of these adaptations are stupid. None of them are malicious. All of them are locally rational. And in Fabric, all of them are fast. Copy the semantic model, adjust a bit of DAX, publish, build reports, share with leadership, bookmark in teams. Before long, you have 3 parallel semantic layers over the same ERP facts, all describing revenue, all with good intent. Then comes board deck day. Finance walks in with a slide that shows revenue for the quarter, 1.02 billion. Sales shows 987 million with a breakdown by region. Operations shows 1.05 billion. With an explanation of capacity strain. The chair asks the only question that matters. What is our revenue? Every number is defensible from the perspective of the team that produced it. None of them are aligned. You can watch the psychology in the room shift. First, they question the tools. Is this a Fabric issue? Then they question the teams. Why are you all using different numbers? Finally, they question the entire analytics estate. If we can't agree on revenue, what else is wrong? You have just experienced trust collapse. Notice what did not fail here. ERP was fine. Pipelines were fine. OneLake was fine. Entra and workspace security were fine. Sensitivity labels and audit logs were fine. The platform delivered consistent data to every team, secured access correctly, and enforced your compliance envelope. What failed was semantic governance. There was no authoritative certified semantic model for revenue that all 3 teams were obligated to reuse. There was no metric owner empowered to say, this is the enterprise definition. If you need a variant, it gets a different name. There was no distinction between local operational revenue for sales and legal revenue for external reporting. Fabric simply made the absence of that discipline visible, fast. In a legacy world, the friction would have slowed this down. It would have taken months for each team to get their own cubes, their own extracts, their own bespoke logic deployed. The inconsistency would still exist. You just might never see all 3 numbers on the table at the same time. In Fabric, the path from idea to propagated meaning is short and smooth. So the lesson here is not stop sales from building models or lock everything down in a central finance workspace. The lesson is simpler and more uncomfortable. If you don't govern semantics, Fabric will happily let every domain industrialize its own truth. You'll end up with 3 revenue numbers, all secured, all audited, all cataloged, and none of them reliably reusable at enterprise scale. This is why in mature tenants, you start seeing a hard distinction between certified semantic models for core entities and KPIs, owned and curated by a platform or domain steward, and everything else, local, promoted, experimental, explicitly not authoritative. Without that distinction, you're not doing self-service. You're manufacturing semantic drift at scale. And no amount of tightening access rights will fix a board deck with 3 answers to the same question. Scenario 2, healthcare. PHI in the wrong lakehouse. Finance drift costs you trust. Healthcare drift costs you your license. So take the same architectural pattern and move it into a regulated clinical environment. You roll out Fabric in a healthcare organization. On paper, you do the right things. There is a clinical domain. There is a research domain. There is an operations domain. PHI is supposed to live only in tightly controlled clinical lakehouses and warehouses with hardened workspaces, restricted groups, and very nervous compliance officers watching purview. But Project Reality does not care about your diagram. A cross-functional analytics initiative spins up, reducing emergency department wait times, for example. It needs scheduling data, triage codes, lab turnaround times, maybe some patient journey information to see where delays occur. The project team does the natural thing in Fabric. They create a new workspace. It sits in the operations domain because that's who's sponsoring the work. They add a lakehouse. They call it something like ED Analytics Temp because it's just for this project. Nobody intends this to be a long-lived clinical data product. It's a sandbox with a deadline. Data engineers start shortcutting in what they need. Some comes from operational systems, bed management, staffing, equipment tracking. Some comes from mirrored clinical data but de-identified upstream. Some, however, comes directly from a clinical source because the upstream masking isn't ready and the project sponsor is impatient. A few tables in this temporary lakehouse now contain direct identifiers. MRNs, dates of birth, visit IDs. The intent is to strip them out later in the pipeline. The reality is that the lakehouse is now PHI bearing, regardless of what your architecture diagram says. At the same time, workspace access is generous. It has to be, because this is cross-functional. You have operations analysts, clinical leads, vendor consultants tuning triage models, a few data scientists doing patient flow simulations, and some integration engineers wiring up real-time feeds. The fastest way to get everyone unblocked is familiar. Add them as members or contributors. We can tighten it later. So you now have PHI in a workspace that was never designed or classified as a clinical environment, granted to a wider and less controlled audience than any of your regulated domains. Fabric does exactly what you asked. Entra authenticates every identity. Workspace roles are respected. OneLake security enforces who can query which tables. Audit logs capture every access. Nothing escapes the tenant. From a pure platform security perspective, nothing is on fire. Purview scanning eventually runs over this lakehouse. It detects patterns that look like identifiers. Maybe some columns get labeled as confidential or highly confidential. A few automated rules apply, but the workspace is still tagged in your head as operational analytics, not clinical PHI. The problem only becomes visible when someone asks the wrong question at the right time. An auditor traces PHI lineage and lands unexpectedly in the operations domain. A consultant exports a subset to work on it in their own environment, believing it to be de-identified operations data. A routine access review shows dozens of non-clinical identities with red writes on tables that now clearly contain PHI. Environment and intent were misaligned. You thought clinical domain meant clinical data. The system did not. It only understands where data actually is, not where you wished it would be. This is data governance drift, but the mechanics are the same as in finance. A temporary lakehouse became a de facto data product. A workspace created for speed became a long-lived environment. Access expanded faster than classification. The meaning of that workspace shifted from operations metrics to actual patient data, and nobody updated the mental or technical model to match. Semantic governance shows up here as well. Downstream, someone builds a notebook that computes readmission risk on this mixed data set. Another person wraps it in a semantic model. A dashboard appears in yet another workspace, surfacing risk scores by facility. Copilot arrives and happily answers, which hospitals have the highest readmission risk this month? Using whatever model is easiest to reach. From a tool perspective, this is a success story. From a regulatory perspective, it is a slow motion incident, because the question you will be asked after any investigation is not, did you have RBAC? It is, how did PHI end up accessible in that environment to those identities with that lineage? And the honest architectural answer is, you treated where as a proxy for what? You assumed environments implied classification. Fabric did not. The lesson here is brutal but simple. Lakehouse sprawl without hard domain and classification boundaries is a compliance trap. You will end up with PHI in the wrong lakehouse, shared with the wrong people, powering semantics nobody ever approved. Security will say access was authenticated. Audit will say logs exist. Regulators will say you lost control of meaning and location. Governance for Fabric in healthcare is not just about locking PHI down. It is about engineering domains, workspaces, and semantic layers so that regulated meaning cannot quietly drift into unregulated places, no matter how many temporary lakehouses your project teams create. Scenario 3. Retail, self-service becomes shadow analytics. If healthcare shows you the cost of getting domains wrong, retail shows you the cost of getting self-service wrong. Different stakes, same mechanics. Picture a large retail organization that prides itself on being data-driven. They've rolled out Fabric with a very explicit mandate from the top. Enable analysts, remove bottlenecks, no more 6-month waits for a new report. On paper, this is healthy. There is a central lakehouse or warehouse with clean sales, store, product, and promotion tables. The data engineering team has done the right thing, standardized schemas, built conform dimensions, set up incremental loads. A baseline semantic model exists with the obvious KPIs. Sales, margin, units, same-store sales, promotion uplift. Then the self-service story starts. Analysts in merchandising, pricing, and marketing are all told correctly to reuse that central semantic model. So they connect to it from their own workspaces, build some reports, and start asking for tweaks. The first round of requests is reasonable. Can we get a version of sales that excludes staff purchases? We need same-store sales defined at a market cluster level, not just store. Our region wants to see promotion uplift excluding clearance items. The platform team tries to keep up. They add a few more measures. They expose some calculation groups. But the backlog grows and the pressure to move fast doesn't go away. At some point, a senior analyst discovers how cheap cloning is. They take the certified semantic model, hit Save As into their own workspace and start adjusting DAX. Maybe they rename nothing to keep reports working. Maybe they append Marsh region to a few measures. Either way, they now have a forked model. Direct Lake makes this frictionless. There's no extra storage cost, no duplicated refresh schedules. The cloned model reads the same delta tables underneath with the same performance profile, word spreads. Within a quarter, you have dozens of near-identical semantic models orbiting the same sales tables. Each workspace has its own flavor. Merchandising has net sales that excludes returns after a certain window. Pricing has margin adjusted for vendor rebates. Marketing has promotion uplift that ignores campaigns below a spend threshold. E-commerce has same-store sales defined in terms of digital traffic cohorts. Locally, every one of these models is useful. They answer specific questions faster than the central team ever could. The self-service mandate looks on the surface like a success, but something subtle has changed. You no longer have one semantic layer for sales. You have a semantic swarm. And because Fabric is doing its job, they all look equally legitimate. They live in proper workspaces. They respect RLS. Some are even endorsed or promoted because a local manager liked the dashboards. In the OneLake catalog and in Copilot, they all show up when somebody searches for sales or margin. Then the business pressure ramps up. A bad quarter hits. Execs start asking hard questions. Which promotions actually drove incremental revenue? Are we discounting too deeply in certain regions? Is our same-store sales trend hiding underlying volume decline? Different teams run to their preferred models. Marketing pulls numbers from their workspace. Pricing pulls theirs. Finance tries to stick to the original certified model, but they've quietly added a few measures of their own to keep pace with ad hoc asks. Everyone is technically using Fabric. Nobody is using the same semantics. The first sign of trouble is not a big debate. It's a subtle mismatch. A VP sees two different same-store sales percentages in two separate decks and asks, why is your chart showing minus 1.8 and theirs is minus 0.5? Nobody can answer cleanly without opening DAX. The conversation that follows is never about DAX. It's about trust. Which model is correct? Who owns the definition of same-store sales? Why do we have 5 different versions of promotion uplift? The honest answer is architectural. In the rush to empower self-service, nobody drew a hard boundary between reusable governed semantics that represent enterprise truth and local contextual semantics that are allowed to diverge. Fabric didn't create the shadow analytics, it industrialized it. In the Excel era, analysts did all of this anyway, just on their laptops. You knew it was a risk, but it was mostly trapped in files and email threads. In Fabric, every fork is a first-class object. Every fork is shareable, discoverable, and consumable by AI. Shadow analytics graduates into shadow truth. Notice again what did not fail. Workspace security was fine. Data access was fine. Performance was often excellent. Purview could see all the assets. What failed was semantic governance and platform boundaries. Self-service without semantic boundaries is not empowerment. It is drift with a friendly UI. The mature pattern in retail tenants looks very different. There is a small set of certified domain-owned semantic models for core commercial concepts. Sales, margin, same-store sales, promotion, uplift. These are treated as APIs, not convenience layers. And if you want to use those meanings, you reference those models. Local teams are explicitly allowed to build their own metrics, but they must give them different names, and those models are never certified as authoritative for the core KPIs. In other words, you don't stop analysts from moving fast. You stop them from silently redefining shared words. If you skip that step, Fabric will faithfully implement your self-service mandate. And you will wake up one quarter with excellent tooling, fast reports, and an organization that can no longer answer a basic question. When we say same-store sales in this meeting, whose meaning did we just import? Scenario 4. Manufacturing OneLake as a shared junk drawer. If retail shows you semantic drift in KPIs, manufacturing shows you physical drift in the lake itself. And this one usually starts with a sentence every architect has heard. Let's just put it all in one lake so it's easy to find later. You roll Fabric into a manufacturing organization that has been starved of integrated data for a decade. You've got IoT telemetry from machines, MES data about work orders and line states, ERP data for materials, production orders and cost, quality systems for defects and inspections, a long tail of spreadsheets living in shared drives. On the whiteboard, the story is elegant. OneLake will be the single enterprise lake. Domains will own their workspaces. Data products will emerge. Engineering will have a proper foundation for predictive maintenance, OEE, and supply chain visibility. Then projects start. A plant-level team spins up a workspace to look at downtime patterns on line 7. They add a lakehouse. They shortcut in some IoT data. They drop some CSVs from legacy systems into files because the connector work isn't done yet. A global quality initiative kicks off. Different workspace, another lakehouse. They ingest defect records from a separate system, plus a subset of machine telemetry someone exported for them last year and uploaded just so we have it nearby. The supply chain analytics group wants to correlate supplier performance with scrap. They create their own workspace, their own lakehouse, and start pulling from whatever looks vaguely relevant in one lake, plus some mirrored ERP tables. Everyone is moving fast. Everyone is doing the right thing from their local point of view. Nobody is curating one lake as a whole. What emerges over 12 months is not a lake, it is a junk drawer. You see the symptoms immediately if you open the OneLake catalog without rose-tinted glasses. Dozens of lakehouses named after projects, not domains. PlantX 2024, OEE pilot, supplier scrap study, temp machine data, tables copied 3 or 4 times with slight naming differences, folders full of one-off CSVs that were just for exploration but are now feeding production reports. Domains exist on paper, but in practice they're not enforced. Workspaces drift into whatever domain someone happened to pick during creation. Some aren't assigned at all. Downstream, semantic models and notebooks start hard-coding paths. An analyst building a downtime dashboard doesn't think in terms of data products, they think in terms of the table that worked last time. So their DAX or SQL points at PlantX 2024, lakehouse dbo.downtime events with a fixed path, not at a curated, domain-owned table that's guaranteed to exist in 5 years. A data scientist training a predictive maintenance model grabs CSVs from a files folder in OE Pilot because those files had the right columns. They point notebooks directly at those blobs with absolute paths. At first, it feels productive, and then you try to clean up. A central platform team finally looks at capacity metrics and says, we need to archive some of this clutter. They propose consolidating lakehouses, renaming a few for consistency, maybe reorganizing folders so that gold data lives somewhere predictable. The minute they do, invisible dependencies start to snap. That downtime dashboard fails silently because the table moved. It doesn't crash spectacularly. It just starts returning fewer rows because the analyst's hard-coded filter no longer matches the reorganized schema. The predictive model still runs, but it's now pointing at an old CSV that nobody updates because the data scientist's notebook refers to a path in OE Pilot that the cleanup script copied but nobody maintains. A monthly KPI report for executive manufacturing reviews flips from green to red because someone optimized a lakehouse by dropping a column they thought nobody used, breaking a join in a semantic model they'd never heard of. From the platform's perspective, nothing special happened. Folders were renamed, tables were consolidated, shortcuts moved, all legal operations. From the business's perspective, core production KPIs just started lying. Operations managers see availability numbers jump around without corresponding changes on the floor. Quality leaders see defect rates mysteriously flatline for one product family because the source table got filtered when it moved. Finance starts questioning whether the cost per unit metrics they've been using to justify capital spend are even based on current data. You now have the worst possible combination. One lake is full. Nobody trusts it. Everyone keeps their own side spreadsheets, just in case. Again, notice where the platform did its job. Security was enforced. Telemetry came in. ERP mirrors updated. Audit logs captured who changed what. What you never did was declare for manufacturing what one lake is allowed to be. Is it a governed data product surface where only curated domain-owned lakehouses are allowed to serve as sources of record? Or a convenient dumping ground where any project can create a lakehouse, throw data in, and hope somebody else makes sense of it later? You can't have both. In mature manufacturing tenants, the pattern looks different. There is a small set of domain lakehouses, manufacturing operations, quality, supply chain. They own the gold tables, they own the contracts, they publish certified semantic models on top. Projects do not create their own permanent lakehouses. They get ephemeral workspaces with clear expiry. Anything that graduates to used in production must be promoted into a domain lakehouse under domain ownership with a life cycle. One lake stops being a shared junk drawer. It becomes what it was sold as, a shared storage fabric behind governed data products. If you skip that discipline, the outcome is guaranteed. You will still have a single logical lake. You will simply have recreated every bad pattern from your old file shares, this time on top of a platform that makes it easier than ever for those bad patterns to power critical decisions and AI systems you can't easily unwind. Scenario 5, AI and Copilot, garbage meaning accelerated. By the time AI shows up in your Fabric tenant, all of the drift we've talked about is already there. You have finance with 3 defensible revenue numbers, healthcare with PHI straying into the wrong lakehouses, retail with a swarm of near-identical sales models, manufacturing with one lake treated as shared storage, not a product surface. Into that environment, someone enables Copilot and Fabric data agents. On paper, the story is compelling. You point Copilot at your Fabric tenant. It discovers semantic models, reports, lakehouses. It reads descriptions. It inspects relationships. It learns that revenue exists in multiple models, that churn is a measure with dependencies, that risk score is computed in a particular warehouse. Executives are told, now you can just ask questions in natural language and get answers grounded in your own data. And technically that's true. But here's the part the marketing diagrams don't emphasize. AI agents do not consume raw data. They consume semantics. When Copilot answers, what was our revenue last quarter? It is not reading Parquet files. It is selecting a semantic model, a measure, a filter context. It is choosing one implementation of revenue over every other one that exists in your tenant. How does it choose? By design, it optimizes for ease of use, relevance, and connectivity. Models that are easier to query, better documented, more frequently used, or closer to the question context tend to win. Certified models matter, but only if they exist and are discoverable. Local, popular models in active workspaces often look more relevant than a pristine but obscure enterprise model nobody tagged correctly. So if your semantic layer is already fractured, Copilot doesn't fix that, it roots through it. Imagine your finance department did the right thing and built an authoritative, certified semantic model in a controlled workspace. It has legal revenue, adjusted revenue, and a dozen carefully curated measures. Ownership is clear, documentation is solid. At the same time, sales has its own workspace with a forked model where revenue is really commissionable revenue, but nobody renamed the measure. It's heavily used. Reports referencing it are open daily. It lives in a workspace with sales in the name and a lot of executive traffic. You ask Copilot in Teams, what was our revenue last quarter in EMEA? From Copilot's perspective, both models are viable. One is certified but lives in a workspace with a finance-centric name, used mostly by finance. The other is promoted, heavily used, and sits right next to the chat context of the person asking. Both answer the question syntactically. If your governance is weak, the sales model often wins. You get a perfectly fluent, confident answer based on commissionable revenue. The number doesn't match last quarter's board deck. Someone notices. The story becomes Copilot is hallucinating. But architecturally, that's not what happened. The AI did exactly what your semantics told it to do. It faithfully reflected the ambiguity you allowed to exist between revenue and commissionable revenue. It selected the path of least resistance through your authorization graph and your usage patterns. The hallucination wasn't in the model. It was in your belief that revenue meant one thing tenant-wide. The same pattern shows up in risk and churn. A data science team builds a churn score in a notebook, exposes it through a warehouse, and wraps it in a semantic model for operational dashboards. Another team, months earlier, built a simpler churned customer flag in a different workspace with different thresholds. Both end up in Fabric. Both are labeled churn. When a COO asks Copilot which customer segments have the highest churn risk right now, the agent must pick one. If the simpler flag happens to be in the more active workspace with more dashboards and more daily usage, it will often be treated as the default. Your most sophisticated model with regulatory justification and careful calibration is bypassed because it lives in a quieter corner of the tenant. Again, from the outside, this looks like AI is unreliable. From the inside, it is semantic governance debt being called in with interest. Data agents amplify this further. When you build a Fabric data agent, you select up to a handful of sources. Semantic models, lakehouses, warehouses, maybe an ontology when IQ matures. You wire tools around them, answer this class of questions, trigger this workflow, summarize these metrics. If you feed an agent a mix of certified and non-certified models, because that's what we had, you've just encoded your drift into an API. Every bot built on top of that agent, in teams, in custom apps, in operations centers, will inherit those ambiguities. Every automation that takes an AI answer and turns it into action will be grounded on whatever meaning was easiest for the agent to reach at configuration time. So here's the high-level pattern. Before AI, semantic drift cost you trust in reports and meetings. After AI, semantic drift drives decisions and automation at speed without you in the loop. That is the actual risk curve. And this is why MVPs who live in this space keep saying a version of the same thing. AI doesn't break your data governance. It removes your ability to hide from how bad it already is. Copilot is not a hallucination engine. It is a semantic mirror. If you're uncomfortable with what you see in that mirror, the work is not to tune prompts. It is to decide finally which meanings in your Fabric tenant are allowed to exist at scale, and to constrain AI to those layers until you've paid down the rest of your semantic debt. Governance is not permissions, redefining the Fabric operating model. By now, one thing should be obvious. You do not have a permissions problem. You have a meaning problem. So if you respond to everything we've just walked through by asking your Fabric admin to tighten access, you've missed the point. Governance is not the same thing as permissions administration. Permissions answer, can this identity touch this object? Governance answers, what is this thing, who owns it, and when is it allowed to be reused? Those are different questions. They need different teams. Most organizations today run Fabric with one of two operating models. On one side, you have the central BI police. Everything goes through one team. They own every dataset. They own every model. They gate every change. Self-service is tolerated, but only on the margins. The result is predictable, long queues, frustrated domains, a flourishing black market of extracts and side systems. On the other side, you have pure self-service anarchy. Every domain owns its own workspaces, builds its own models, and answers its own questions. The platform team manages capacity and maybe sets some basic guardrails, but semantics are not their problem. The result is also predictable. Fast local wins, slow enterprise failures, and AI agents grounded on whatever model somebody happened to click first. Fabric needs a third thing. A Fabric platform team. Not a ticket queue, not a reporting factory. An architectural function. This team's job is to design and maintain the semantic and structural rules of the environment, not to build every report. They define domain boundaries. Which domains exist? Finance, sales, HR, operations, clinical, retail, whatever matches your organization, and which workspaces are allowed to belong to each. They decide with business partners where regulated data is permitted to live and where it is not. They make temporary workspaces a conscious, time-boxed construct instead of an accident. They own workspace strategy. Not in the sense of approving every creation, but of defining patterns. Domain-aligned workspaces, not endless project-aligned ones. Clear dev, test on prod tiers for anything that matters. Explicit isolation for highly regulated domains, so that PHI cannot quietly drift into someone's analytics sandbox because it was convenient. They define certification rules. What qualifies a semantic model as certified? What qualifies a table as master data? Who can apply those endorsements and under what process? How do you ensure that there is exactly one certified definition of customer and revenue per domain and that everything else is explicitly second class? They maintain semantic standards, naming conventions, default grains, time intelligence policies, handling of adjustments and exclusions. The boring work that prevents churn, churned, and churn rate from all meaning different things in different workspaces while using identical display names. And critically, they do all of this as a platform. They do not sit between domains and their work. They sit underneath it. Their mandate is not, you must file a ticket to add a measure. It is, we will make it easier to reuse the right meanings than to reinvent them, and we will make it visible when you drift. In practice, that means designing fabric so that core entities and KPIs live in shared, domain-owned semantic models, discoverable and clearly certified. Local teams consume those models by reference, not by cloning and forking when they just need one more slice. If they truly need a different meaning, they declare a new metric with a new name, and they own it explicitly. It also means that this team arbitrates common entities across domains. When customer shows up in sales, marketing, finance, support, do you want 4 incompatible customer dimensions or one shared backbone with domain-specific extensions? The Fabric platform team forces that conversation before every domain builds its own version. Architecturally, this is the difference. You are not governing who is allowed to open Power BI. You are governing which meanings are allowed to be reused at scale. Access control is necessary. It stops the wrong people from touching the right things. Semantic governance is what stops the right people from trusting the wrong things. Once you adopt that posture, everything about your Fabric operating model changes. You stop seeing workspaces as folders where people put stuff and start seeing them as surfaces where particular meanings are allowed to exist. You stop measuring success by number of dashboards and start measuring it by percentage of consumption that hits certified semantics. You stop asking your admins to be gatekeepers and start asking your platform team to be designers of an authorization and meaning fabric that reflects how your organization actually makes decisions. And once you have that, you can talk about something practical. How do you stand this up without freezing the tenant for a year? You don't need a 5-year program. You need a clear charter, some domains, and a Dave 30.90 plan that turns governance from a slide into a set of irreversible decisions about how Fabric is allowed to behave. The Fabric governance model. Charter, domains, day 30, 90. At this point, you know what goes wrong. Now you need something uncomfortably specific, a way to run Fabric that doesn't depend on heroics or hope. And that starts with a charter, not a slide that says enable self-service. An architectural sentence that answers a harder question: why does Fabric exist in this organization? If your honest answer is because it was in the E5 bundle, stop there. You're not governing, you're decorating. The only charter that survives contact with Fabric looks more like this. We run Fabric so the organization can make trusted decisions at speed, using shared semantics over governed data. Trusted at speed are shared semantics governed data. Everything you do next has to either support that sentence or admit that you're optimizing for something else. From that charter, you define domains. Not just for security, for meaning finance, sales, HR, operations, clinical, retail, whatever maps cleanly to how your organization actually makes decisions. Each domain gets 2 explicit owners. A data owner, accountable for what data is allowed to exist, how it's classified, how it flows. A semantic owner, accountable for what core entities and KPIs mean in that domain, which models are authoritative, and what gets certified. Those are not abstract titles, they are names you can put on a page, and more importantly in Fabric and Purview. Workspaces then align to those domains, not to projects. Instead of Project X and Pilot Y scattered everywhere, you get Finance Prod, Finance Dev, Sales Prod, HR Prod, and so on. Regulated domains, clinical, HR, anything with PHI or payroll, are isolated by design. Dedicated capacities if necessary, hardened workspace settings, no casual shortcuts in or out. Dev, test, prod become tiers you enforce, not vibes. Dev workspaces are where experiments happen. They are noisy, short-lived, and cheap. Test workspaces exist only for things on a path to production. Prod workspaces contain only assets someone is willing to sign for. Inside those prod workspaces, you draw the sharpest line you have. Certified versus promoted semantic models. Certified models are governed, owned, and authoritative. They represent the meanings you are willing to let AI executives and downstream systems reuse at scale. They have an explicit owner, documented logic, and a change process. Promoted models are useful but not trusted. They are allowed to exist. They are allowed to help people think. They are not allowed to silently redefine revenue or customer for the organization. Everything else is experimental, and you treat it that way. Of course, none of this appears magically. You have a tenant full of drift already, so you need a day on day 30, day 90 plan. Day is the freeze. You don't turn Fabric off. You stop net new chaos. You freeze uncontrolled workspace creation by tightening who can create them and under which domains. You stop people from publishing brand new semantic models into production workspaces without review. You identify the top 10 or 20 datasets and models by consumption, the ones most of the organization already depends on, and you put a temporary do not clone casually sticker on them. The goal of day is simple. Stop digging. Day 30 is inventory and ownership. By then, your platform team has run through usage metrics, purview scans, and workspace lists. For anything in a prod-like workspace that is clearly in active use, reports opened regularly, models queried constantly, tables feeding multiple downstream artifacts, you assign an owner, not a team, a person. Every production dataset, every widely used semantic model, every lakehouse that feeds critical dashboards gets a named data owner and, where applicable, a semantic owner. You log that somewhere boring and durable, a catalog, a table, whatever you will actually maintain. In parallel, you define semantic standards for the top handful of KPIs, revenue, customer, churn, risk, whatever your board obsesses over. For each, you decide which model is authoritative, what the definition is, and how it will be surfaced. You stand up the smallest possible certification process that makes changes visible and reviewable without recreating the BI police. By day 30, nothing is everybody's problem anymore. Drift can still happen, but at least you know whose job it is to notice. Day 90 is enforcement. This is where domains stop being labels and start being boundaries. You align every workspace to a domain. You shut down or archive the ones nobody will claim. You enforce that regulated data only lives in regulated domains, and you back that up with purview classification and DLP, not just naming conventions. In Fabric, you turn on the features you were pretending to use, enforce domain isolation, constrain cross-workspace semantic reuse to certified models where it matters, and start wiring AI access, Copilot, data agents, so that by default they can only see certified semantic layers. You also start measuring what percentage of consumption is hitting certified models versus everything else, how many production datasets lack an owner, how many definitions of revenue still exist, and is that number going down. By day 90, the platform will look roughly the same from the outside. The critical difference is this. Before, Fabric reflected your drift and hid it behind good intentions. After, Fabric reflects your intent and makes drift visible the moment it matters. Metrics that matter in Fabric governance. At this point, intent is clear, the operating model is defined. Now you need something much less glamorous. Proof. If you can't measure whether semantic drift is shrinking or growing, you are not governing Fabric. You're decorating it. So what does proof look like in a Fabric tenant? Start with the only metric that really tells you whether semantics are landing. What percentage of enterprise consumption hits certified semantic models? Not how many models are certified. That's vanity. Consumption is the reality. You want to know, across reports, dashboards, Excel connections, and AI agents, what fraction of queries resolve against a small known set of certified models versus everything else. If that number is low, you've built a beautiful semantic layer nobody's actually using. If that number grows over time, you're bending drift back toward intent. Second, data owner coverage. For every dataset, lakehouse, warehouse, and semantic model that behaves like production, meaning people depend on it to make decisions, not just to experiment, you want a named accountable owner. This is binary. There is no partial credit. Either there is a person whose name you can put next to that asset, or there isn't. Your metric is simple: the proportion of production artifacts with a named data owner and, where relevant, a semantic owner. If a model powers revenue, risk, churn, or anything else executives argue about, it belongs to the team is not an answer. Teams don't attend change approval calls. People do. Third, duplicate semantic models per core KPI. Pick the half dozen metrics that define your business. Revenue, customer, churn, risk, same-store sales, whatever fits your reality. For each one, count how many distinct implementations exist in Fabric, not how many times the word appears, how many different DAX or SQL definitions you would find if you traced them. If you have 10 versions of revenue and one certified model, your goal is not to drag everything into central finance. It is to create a visible trajectory. Those 10 becoming 8, then 5, then 3, as teams converge on shared semantics or rename their local variants honestly. You're not chasing perfection, you're chasing monotonic improvement. Fourth, sensitivity label compliance in regulated domains. In clinical HR, finance, anywhere regulators like to live, you want a hard number for how much of the data estate is actually classified and enforced. Purview can tell you how many assets are labeled, which labels they carry, and where labels propagate. Your governance metric is the percentage of tables, files, and models that contain regulated data and also carry the correct sensitivity labels with enforcement policies active. If that number is low, you are not running regulated domains. You are running wishful thinking with good slideware. Fifth, AI consumption from uncertified models. This one is your early warning system for semantic risk. For every Copilot interaction, every data agent query, every AI-driven workflow, you want to know which models were used to answer the question or drive the action, and whether those models were certified, merely promoted, or completely ad hoc. If a large share of AI usage is grounded on uncertified semantics, then your most powerful amplification engine is wired directly into your drift. You shouldn't be surprised when it embarrasses you in front of executives. You should be surprised it hasn't done so more often. There are other metrics you can track, workspace sprawl, orphaned artifacts, time to certify, but these 5 form a minimum viable truth dashboard for Fabric governance. Percentage of consumption on certified semantics. Owner coverage for production assets. Duplicate implementations per core KPI. Label compliance in regulated domains, AI usage grounded on uncertified models. If any of those are unmeasured, you are flying a very expensive platform with the instruments turned off. And if you find yourself tempted to invent softer, more flattering metrics, number of workspaces created, reports published, Copilot questions asked, stop and ask a harder question. Do these numbers tell us anything about whether we are enforcing meaning or just about how busy we are at generating more of it? Because once you start treating semantics as a governed surface, not an accidental byproduct, something else becomes possible. You can apply the same posture to meaning that you already pretend to apply to networks and identities. Zero trust, not just for who connects and from where, but for which definitions you are willing to trust by default. Zero trust for data and semantics. Zero trust has been marketed to you for years. Never trust, always verify. Assume breach. Enforce least privilege. Most organizations dutifully applied that to networks, devices, and sign-ins. They turned on conditional access. They tightened VPNs. They added MFA to anything that moved. Almost nobody applied it to data, and nobody applied it to meaning. In a Fabric world, that gap is no longer theoretical. So take the same 3 zero trust principles and translate them ruthlessly into how you treat both data and semantics. Start with verify explicitly. In identity terms, that means you don't trust a token just because it exists. You evaluate device state, location, risk. In Fabric terms, you extend that posture to 3 layers. Who is this identity in Entra? Which domain and workspace are they operating in? Which semantic models are they allowed to reuse? You stop assuming that because someone works in finance, they should see every finance model. You stop assuming that because a semantic model lives in a prod workspace, it must be authoritative. Every access to a certified semantic model is a decision. Does this person, in this role, in this domain, need to reuse this meaning? If the answer is no, they can still explore data, but they do it against non-certified layers where their experiments can't redefine enterprise truth. Then I'm least privilege. Most people implement least privilege as give analysts viewer, not member. Architecturally, that's shallow. Least privilege for data is not just about rows and columns. It's about which metrics can be referenced where. A sales analyst might need row-level access to detailed transactions in their region. That doesn't mean they should be allowed to build new AI agents grounded on the global certified revenue model. A data scientist working on churn experiments might need full column access to customer features in a sandbox. That doesn't mean their experimental churn score 7 should ever show up in Copilot suggestions for executives. Least privilege for semantics means you constrain which models can be used as sources for other models. You constrain which models AI can see by default. You constrain which models can be referenced across domains without review. You are not just asking, can you query this table? You are asking, can you compose with this meaning? Finally, assume breach. In the network world, that means you operate as though an attacker is already inside. In Fabric, you operate as though drift is already inside, because it is. Assume access has already widened beyond what your diagram says. Assume there are already 5 versions of revenue and 3 of churn in production. Assume there are orphaned models that AI will happily root through if you don't stop it. Assume drift means you build continuous observation into the platform. You monitor for semantic changes. A certified measures definition changes. A model's filters are edited. A key relationship is dropped. Those events aren't just version history, they are governance events. Someone should be alerted. In some cases, downstream consumers should be forced to re-acknowledge that the meaning changed. You monitor for ownership gaps. Production artifacts without owners. certified models where the listed owner hasn't logged in for 6 months, workspaces with high consumption and 0 named stewards. You monitor for usage anomalies, AI agents pulling heavily from uncertified models, sudden spikes in consumption of a sandbox lakehouse, reports in executive apps grounded on non-certified semantics. In other words, you stop trusting your own configuration. You treat every semantic object as guilty until it has a clear owner, a clear definition, a clear endorsement state, and a clear usage pattern that matches its intent. Zero trust for data is not about locking everything down. It is about trusting fewer things by default. You deliberately shrink the set of meanings that are allowed to flow freely into AI, into board decks, into automated workflows. Everything else has to earn its way in through ownership, certification, and observation. Once you take that posture seriously, design decisions change. You create fewer one-off semantic models because you know they will become attack surfaces for drift. You push harder on reuse of certified entities because that's the only way to keep your AI surface area small enough to reason about. You stop pretending that more models is progress and start measuring more consumption on fewer, better models as the real signal. And you stop blaming Fabric for doing exactly what you told it to do. Secure the objects, accelerate the drift. Expose whether you are willing to govern meaning with the same paranoia you already claim to apply to identity. The future, Fabric, AI agents, and meaning at scale. Most organizations still talk about AI as if it were a smarter reporting tool. Architecturally, it is something else. The future of Fabric is not people opening Power BI and clicking through semantic models. It is agents, Copilot, data agents, operational bots consuming your semantics directly without you in the loop. Your semantic model stops being the thing behind the report. It becomes an API to AI. Fabric IQ makes that explicit. Underneath the branding, it is building an ontology, an entity graph, from your existing artifacts: customer, order, shipment, sensor, contract, churn, risk. The relationships, the rules, the constraints. It is taking the semantics you already encoded in models, tables, and logs and compiling them into something agents can reason over. And that sounds powerful. It is also unforgiving. Because wrong meaning scales faster than wrong data. If you mistype a value in a source system, the blast radius is local. A few reports are wrong. Someone notices. You fix it. If you misdefine at-risk customer in the ontology that every AI agent uses to triage support tickets, route renewals, and trigger discounts, that error propagates everywhere, instantly. Every bot that calls that definition makes the same wrong decision. Every automation built on top of those bots inherits the same flaw. You don't just have a bad report. You have institutionalized a bad rule. Fabric's direction is clear. More of your operational logic will live in that semantic layer. Operational agents watch real-time streams from OneLake, KQL, or IoT. They use the ontology to understand that truck temperature threshold for more than 4 hours and shipment contains vaccine means cold chain breach, which means alert compliance, hold inventory, notify customer. That's not a dashboard. That is a controlled process grounded in semantics. If the ontology is wrong, if vaccine doesn't include a new product line, if the threshold logic was copied from a pilot and never updated, then the agent will do exactly what you told it at machine speed with no hesitation. This is the uncomfortable consistency of AI. Agents are not creative about your meanings. They are obedient. They will apply whatever definitions they can reach. They will not stop mid-workflow and ask, are you sure this is the right revenue? Or did legal approve this risk score for use in Europe? That's your job upstream. So the question, how do I govern Fabric data access, quietly becomes, which semantics am I willing to expose as APIs to automation and under what conditions? That is what Fabric IQ and future agents formalize. They turn your loosely managed semantic layer into a first-class dependency graph for decision-making, compliance, and control. They don't create new risk categories. They compress the time it takes for your existing semantic risk to turn into real-world consequences. Organizations that understand this treat semantics as critical infrastructure. They build change control for measures the way they build change control for firewall rules. They test new ontology relationships with synthetic scenarios before letting agents act on them. They restrict AI access to a narrow band of certified concepts until they've earned the right to widen it. Everyone else keeps asking why Copilot hallucinates, when in reality, it is just following their ontology. The future of Fabric is not optional semantics. It is meaning at scale. You either govern that meaning on purpose or you watch AI industrialize whatever you left lying around. The real answer to how do I govern Fabric data access? So here's the honest answer to the question people type into search. You govern Fabric data access by treating access as the easy part and meaning as the hard part. Entra, OneLake, workspace roles, purview, the platform already knows how to lock doors. Your real work is deciding which semantics are allowed to leave the room, who owns them, and when AI is allowed to reuse them without asking. Fabric is secure by design. Your data model will drift unless governance is engineered into creation, sharing, and consumption. If you're responsible for enterprise data trust, Your next steps are simple and non-optional. Define domains, stand up a real platform team, certify semantics, measure drift, and keep AI constrained to what you actually trust. Because Microsoft Fabric doesn't break data governance. It exposes whether your organization can agree on truth fast enough to scale AI.